Hello my dear friends, you're in the middle of a summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the conflict on the territory of Ukraine, where it's becoming more and more difficult to hide the reality and to hide the truth. We're not talking about fuel crisis that is brewing both on the territories of Russia and Ukraine. We're talking about the situation on the ground and the need of evacuation of both the cities of Sumy and Kharkiv. During the previous 12 hours, we received lots of very interesting statements on this matter. For example, several sources connected with the situation in the city of Sumy stated that the Sumy mayor says we shouldn't listen to rumors that they want to evacuate the city of Sumy. They have started to sell fuel from the back of cars. This is not some unorganized money-making scheme, but rather planned operation by government structures. The vehicles drive around and you flag them down. So as you can see, due to the situation that the gas stations through the city of Sumy and the Sochi and the Sumy region were wiped out by Russians as a result of massive and daily attacks, now the Ukrainians are trying to find the solution how to stabilize the situation, and this is one of the options. At the same time, today we received the video that the Russians destroyed another gas station in the central part of the city of Sumy, this one. So now we can say that probably maybe one or two gas stations left through the city of Sumy, and now locals are trying to sell fuel using cars. Since the beginning of the fuel war, the Russians destroyed 3 gas stations in the western parts of the city, several gas stations in the northern parts of the city, and several through the eastern parts of the city. But as we can see, despite this situation, the Sumy mayor says that we shouldn't listen to rumors. Another important thing is that the Russians, when they finished the gas stations through the city itself, began attacking and destroying gas stations along N07 road. And during the previous day, we received lots of pictures and lots of videos on this matter. Lots of gas stations were destroyed by Russians, and all these gas stations were geolocated. Furthermore, the Russians destroyed not just gas stations, but also the Russians continue wiping out the oil bases and objects of fuel infrastructure. At the same time, we continue receiving reports that the Russians continue their offensive operation around the city of Sumy. As for the second defense layer, since the beginning of the 3rd of July, we haven't received anything on the matter about additional progress on the ground from the Russian side, but today pro-Ukrainian sources confirmed that the Russians improved positions significantly between the settlements of Miropolska and Miropolye. And these are the changes on the ground. Pro-Ukrainian sources added additional infiltration zone, and according to these changes, the Russians continue advancing further in the western direction, just with one purpose: to get the road to T1901 and to get to the river of Ribitsa. So as of now, we can say that it's still too far before the beginning of the battle for the city of Sumy itself, but as of now, the Russians are tasked to take on the complete control the rivers in the area of the city. Now let's move further and let's talk about the city of Kharkiv. As for this territory, we see that the situation in this area differs from the situation in the area of the city of Sumy. We are not talking about the situation on the ground, we are talking about the relation of local authorities to the evacuation process. As you can see, we have added additional black zones through the Kharkiv region. So this is the situation, for example, by the end of the 2nd of July, and this is the situation by the end of the 3rd of July, and these black zones means the territories of mandatory evacuation of Kharkiv region. The Ukrainian local authorities announced the evacuation of these territories around the cities of Zolochev, Dergachi, Kazachi, Lopань, and of the territories in the area of the settlement of Shevchenkove, and this is already the Oskol or the Kupiansk direction. So big territories were announced, were subject of a mandatory evacuation evacuation through the Kharkiv region, and this means something. And obviously this means that these evacuated territories, the Ukrainians, the authorities, the military authorities of Ukraine would try to fill with forces, soldiers and units just with one purpose: to slow down the Russian offensive. And due to this picture, due to this configuration of evacuation zones to the north and to the northwest of the city of Kharkiv, this means that the Russians are planning here to carry out something. During the previous 12 hours, lots of videos were published from this area. For example, in this video we can see how the Russians were attacking the settlement of Klinovo Novoselovka with aviation, bombing and attacking with FABs positions and temporary deployment points of the armed forces of Ukraine. And as of the previous days, I would like to remind you that just during the 2nd of July of 2026, we received the report that Russians improved their positions once again through the northern parts of the city of Kazachalopo. And according to the latest changes, we can see that the Russians approached the central part of the settlement and that the Russians continue advancing. So according to this evacuation zone, we can say that the battle for Kharkiv begins. Meanwhile, the Russians continue wiping out gas stations through the city of Kharkiv itself, and as of the previous 24 hours, at least 2 gas stations were destroyed through the city of Kharkiv, the first one in the northeastern parts of the settlement and the second one in the central part of the city of Kharkiv. And here we can see a video how locals and how special fire teams were trying to extinguish the fire. As a result of attack, the gas station was completely destroyed, and we know that this is not the first gas station that was wiped out by Russians. Since the beginning of the fuel war, the Russians have destroyed probably dozens of gas stations through the Kharkiv region, and the Russians continue isolating the city of Kharkiv from the mainland. Another important thing concerning the Kharkiv region is that for the first time, probably since 2024, the Russians improved their positions in the Liptsy-Gluboka direction. So these are the changes on the ground, and today pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the Russia's sabotage and reconnaissance groups began advancing further in the southern direction along the Travianska water reservoir and on the Ukraine side of this water reservoir, which means that the Russians right now continue their offensive operation through the northern Kharkiv direction using broad frontline attacks. Now let's talk about the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region, where the Ukrainians also announced the evacuation through the city of Shevchenkove, right in the middle between the Pechenegi water reservoir and the river of Seversky Donets. So as you can see, the Ukrainians announced the evacuation zone right in the middle, probably with the purpose to fill these territories with troops and soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine, just with one purpose: not to allow the Russians to advance further. It seems that the Ukrainians probably got used to the situation that most likely they would be forced to fall back from the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region and from the area of the river of Oskol along the Kupiansk agglomeration and so on towards the settlement of Shevchenkove, with the purpose to stabilize the situation in this area and not allow the Russians to move further in the western direction, with the purpose to outflank the city of Kharkiv from the southeast. And as for the northeastern direction, today we received the report that the Russians began clashes for the settlement of Belyi Kolodez. Today the group of forces north published another report about the situation on the ground, and today the Russians stated that small arms fire continues near the cemetery in the village of Losivka, in Zemlyannoy Yar, and on the approaches to the village of Belyi Kolodez. So for the first time since the beginning of the Russian offensive operation in this area, we received the report that small arms fire continues or started around the settlement on the approaches to the settlement of Belyi Kolodez, which means that the Russians are getting closer and closer to the heart of the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region. If Ukrainians lose control over the settlement of Belyi Kolodez, they would be forced to fall back further in the southern direction, and the Russians would be able to cut these huge territories, this big number of territories in the most northeastern part parts of the settlement. As for the village of Losivka, the group of forces north stated that the clashes are taking place around the Losivka cemetery, and this is the cemetery itself, which means that in coming days, most likely the group of forces north and the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm complete control over this locality. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kupiansk direction. Another important thing worth attention that we started adding evacuation zones just these days, and I would like to remind you that during the fall of 2026, Ukrainian authorities first announced the evacuation of these territories. So these villages have been already evacuated by the armed forces of Ukraine, and now the Ukrainians, as you can see, expanded the evacuation zone further in the western direction, which means that the Ukrainians expect that the clashes for this evacuation zone is about to start. And probably this is the situation how the things are going to develop, because according to the latest changes and to the updates we've received since the beginning of July, the Russians are about to finish the battle for the Russian side of the river of Oskol. Since the beginning of July, lots of changes were recorded between the villages and cities like Kupiansk, Uzlavoy, Kovsharovka, Novoosivka, Kurilovka. The Russians managed to take all these territories under complete control, and we have lots of proofs, and all these updates are telling us just about one thing: the Russians control the eastern bank of the river of Oskol, probably up to 99% in the area of the Kupiansk-Uzlavoy agglomeration, which means that the next possible step from the Russian side could be an attempt to cross the river of Oskol with the purpose to establish a foothold on the Ukrainian side of the river along the villages of Serhiivka, Pristin, Osinova, Kupiansk, and many other different villages in this area. And if it happens, this is going to be the beginning of the battle for the Kharkiv, for the southeastern Kharkiv direction. So let's of course wait and see what is going to happen next, but we see that the situation around the city of Kharkiv continues deteriorating. Moving further, as of the previous days and as of the previous 24 hours, and after the Russians managed to break the situation in the northern Kupiansk direction, the Russians shift their focus to the southern Kupiansk direction or to the Borova pocket. During the previous 24 hours, the map has been adjusted significantly. In the area of the eastern Borova pocket, we can see the changes. The changes are very big, and the changes were made based on the reports that were published by pro-Russian, very reliable mappers, and based on the video that was published also by pro-Russian sources, where we could see dozens of episodes with Russian soldiers through this territory. Based on this video and based on the map adjustment of a very reliable source, we have adjusted the map as well. The news around the Borova, about the Borova pocket, is tightening, and most likely in coming days we will start receiving lots of changes on the ground in this area, and we'll start receiving first reports about Ukraine retreat from this territory further in the southwestern direction towards the cities of Oskol and Izum and Kupiansk. Izum and Oskol. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the area of the cities of Slavyansk-Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, Druzhkivka. During the previous 24 hours, no changes on the ground were recorded, but very interesting details were recorded. First of all, this situation concerns the territory between the cities of Konstantinovka and Alexeyevka, Druzhkivka. First of all, and the most important thing is that since the beginning almost of July, we have stopped receiving any updates about the situation in the northern Kupiansk area. We're talking not about just reports published by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, we're talking about videos of FPV drone strikes. So, for example, this is the situation by the end of the 3rd of July, this is the situation by the end of the 2nd of July, this is the situation by the end of the 1st of July. So the 1st of July is the last date when we received at least anything from the most northern part of the city of Kupiansk. And here we can see how the Russians were attacking Ukrainians that were trying to answer the most northern parts, and this was the last date. Since the 1st of July of 2026, and probably since the end of June of 2026, the number of updates coming from the settlement of Alexandrovka of Druzhkivka has intensified significantly. These days we receive more and more videos of how Russians were FPV droning and attacking vehicles, soldiers and troops and personnel of the armed forces of Ukraine through this territory, which means that the focus and the Russian activities shift from the northern parts of the city of Kupiansk to the southern parts of the settlement Alexandrovka Druzhkivka, which confirms first of all and means that the battle for the city begins. Currently these clashes and a small arms fight is taking place on the outskirts of the settlement, but the Russians are moving further. Now let's move further and let's begin our discussion about the Dnipropetrovsk direction. During the previous 24 hours and since the beginning of July, the map in this area has been adjusted significantly. So, for example, this is the end of the 29th of June of 2026, and this is the moment when the situation changed significantly. This is the end of the 30th of June of 2026, and we received the first report that Russians managed to break through Ukraine's defense through the eastern parts of the settlement of Dobropolye and to dig in deeper through the eastern parts of the last stronghold in the Dnipropetrovsk and the northern Donetsk regions. Between the 1st of July and the 3rd of July, the Russians improved their position significantly around the settlements of Grishina, Serhiivka, and this dense network of villages between Dobropolye and Grishina. And these are the first changes on the ground during this period of time. The Russians are about to establish complete control over the settlement of Shevchenkove. This information was confirmed by different sources, and the most important thing is that the Russians during the same period of time managed to improve their position significantly around the village of Serhiivka. This information was confirmed by neutral mappers and pro-Russian sources. And as of the end of the 3rd of July of 2026, we received a report from a very reliable pro-Russian source that first stormtroopers, first soldiers of the armed forces of the Russian Federation answered the settlement of Serhiivka from the east, and this is the most important update. And furthermore, according to these pro-Russian sources, according to these the Russians control by the end of the 3rd of July of 2026, the Russians established control for more than 15% of the settlement, and the Russians continue advancing. And this is something like a breakthrough already in the Dnipropetrovsk direction. The Russians right now attack in the area between the settlements of Pokrovske and Serhiivka using broad front line attack, and it seems that the Russians are tasked to continue advancing further in the northwestern direction using broad front line attack, and it seems that the Russians are tasked to break through Ukraine's defense and to approach the settlement of Pavlograd, which is something like one of the most important logistic hubs between the western parts of Ukraine and the line of combat contact, especially in the area of the city of Kharkiv. It seems that from this configuration the Russians are still very far from the battle for the city of Kharkiv, but it seems that the Russians make everything possible to let this battle happen, probably in 2027. So as of the previous 24 hours, once again, the Russians answered the settlement of Serhiivka and managed to dig in deeper. Moving further, and let's talk about the area of responsibilities of the Group of Forces East. Today, pro-Russian sources and the Group of Forces East and the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that the Russians, as a result of clashes, established complete control over the settlement by the name of Alexandrovka, which is already a part of the Pokrovske agglomeration. And the Russians started the battle for this territory probably somewhere on the 28th of June of 2026, maybe a bit earlier, during the 26th of June of 2026. 26th. So this is the situation when everything started and when the Russians managed to break through Ukraine's defense. So this is the end of the 26th of June. This is the end of the 27th of June. The Russians improved their positions along the river of Volcha in the area of the settlement of Novoskiluvate. This is the end of the 27th of June. The Russians improved their positions around the settlement of Pisantsy. This is the end of the 29th of June, when the Ukrainians were forced to fall back from the area by the name of Bogodarivka. And 3 days later, the Russians reports that they finished the battle for the settlement of Alexandrovka, and which means that the Ukrainians are no longer able to hold the lines in this area. And furthermore, and the most important thing, that the Russians published this video where we can see how exactly the battle for Alexandrovka was taking place. Lots of episodes were published how the Russians were attacking the territory, and through the final part of this video we can see several flags that were raised by Russians at different places of the settlement of Alexandrovka. At least 5 flags were recorded through the video, which means that Russians have strong control over the territory. Different military experts reported that now the Russians have many possibilities what to do next. Some sources reported that Russians would continue offensive operation in the area of the settlement of Pokrovske. The group of forces east will continue advancing further in the northern direction with the purpose to create a stable foothold on the Ukraine side of the river of Volcha. Furthermore, would like to remind you that the Ukrainians have already evacuated the territory to the north in advance. From the area of Pokrovske, the Russians may finish the battle for the settlements of Velika Mikhailovka on the same side of the river, for the villages of Gavrilovka and Podgavrilovka, and the Russians would be able to cut the pockets between the settlements of Pokrovske and Velika Mikhailovka. We're talking about this one. This can lead to the situation when the Russians would be able to maintain the line through the Dnipropetrovsk direction, and then from these positions the Russians with the group of forces center could continue offensive operation further in the direction of the city of Pavlograd with the purpose to break through Ukraine's defense and to cut the cities of Dnipro and Zaporozhye from the city of Kharkiv. Now let's move further. As for the cities of Zaporozhye and Dnipro, as for the Dnipro and Zaporozhye regions, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians continued attacking objects of fuel infrastructure. More oil bases were destroyed by Russians, and Russians published this video where we can see this. And the most important, more gas stations were destroyed by Russians, and this is the most important thing. During the previous 24 hours, according to Russian sources, the Russians have set another record on this matter. A dozen of gas stations was destroyed between the cities of Odessa and Chernihiv. So everything along the line of combat contact, and we see that the Russians started the third phase of the fuel war. During the first phase of the fuel war, the Russians destroyed gas stations between through the northern parts of Ukraine, through these territories, and that situation led to the moments when the Ukrainians stopped using these territories to attack deep inside of the territory of Russia, and the effectiveness of Ukraine's attack through this area dropped significantly. During the second phase of the fuel war, the Russians destroyed gas stations between Zaporozhye, Dnipro and Kharkiv, so the gas stations through these territories were wiped out by Russians. And now the Russians begin the third fuel war, and during the third fuel war the Russians are planning to wipe out gas stations between the cities of Dnipro, Zaporozhye, Nikolaev, Kherson and Odessa. And if all these things happen, the Ukrainians would be forced to move their logistics, main hubs and main launching sites in the direction of the central part of Ukraine. But from these positions, most likely the effectiveness of Ukraine's strikes deep inside of the territory of Russia would drop significantly without any chances to bring results to the armed force of Ukraine. But at the same time, we see that the Russians also suffer problems with fuel, but it seems that the Russians are doing right now the situation with fuel with the purpose to keep fuel until they finish the third fuel phase operation. When they finish the situation, they will give fuel to Russians. So they're trying to keep fuel for as long as possible, with the purpose not to allow the Ukrainians to attack gas stations through the territory of Russia, because if Ukrainians begin attacking gas stations through the territory of Russia, we might see a fuel collapse on the territory of Russia as well. And today we received a very important statement made by Ukraine's authorities. The Ukrainians want to have a ceasefire during the fall of 2026 to hold elections. Today, pro-Ukrainian authorities stated, we have already discussed the situation on the main channel, and if you remember, I told you that Zelensky proposed to Russia through the president of the Republic of Belarus to hold elections both on the territory of Russia and Ukraine, and he asked the Russians to create the situation when both the Russians and the Ukrainians will not make a mess for each other, so the Ukrainians would be able to hold elections and the Russians, and so on. The Russians are going to have the parliament elections in the fall of 2026. The Ukrainians, Zelensky wants to hold presidential elections during the same period of time, and when elections end, the clashes would resume. So this is the formula of Zelensky, but I would like to remind you that the president of the Russian Federation rejected this idea, which means that most likely the Ukrainians in coming days, probably a month before the beginning of elections, the Ukrainians would begin another massive strikes, massive waves of attacks through the territory of Russian Federation, with the purpose to destroy gas stations, objects of energy infrastructure, just with one purpose: to ruin Russia's plans and Putin's plans regarding the elections in fall of 2026. But the Russians right now are trying to prepare themselves before these dates, so which means that August and September of 2026 are going to be very hot and very difficult. And that's it for today. The Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.